Well, like I said, thanks for
But
joining.
interviews can always email me at info@endingpd.org, and I'm happy to learn more about it. This is how I learn.
Yeah, exactly. Like I gave you that information about when I was exposed to trichloroethylene in Connecticut, and you were telling me about the place I worked at. Used to have the people that took away the chemicals became a Superfund site in Plantsville, Connecticut. So what inspired you to become a MD and become a movement disorder specialist, out of curiosity?
Everyone likes this question. Both my parents were psychiatrists, so I like to say I rebelled and I became a neurologist.
Interesting. But how come specifically neurology and not some other field, though?
I just I like the brain, and then for Parkinson's, I like the fact that you interact a lot with people. It's very clinical in its orientation, and you can make people better. And then more recently, the last 5 years, 6 years, I think we can just have a world where Parkinson's is really rare, that people don't need to suffer with it. As I've said in other things, I get pissed off when I see someone with Parkinson's now, because I think most of the time it's preventable, and that people don't need to suffer with this very disabling and deadly disease.
Is that one of the reasons that motivated you to write this book?
I wrote this book, thank you, Ending Parkinson's. I got a sabbatical, one of the gifts of being an academic, and then I read a lot of the work of Dr. Caroline Tanner, who's now at UC San Francisco, and she detailed that most of Parkinson's is due to environmental causes, studying twins and showing that genetic factors were not a factor for people over age 50 who develop Parkinson's disease, and that pesticide paraclots associated with 150% increased risk of Parkinson's. The dry cleaning chemical trichloroethylene that you mentioned, the same chemical that's in Connecticut, same thing was in Woburn, Massachusetts for a civil action, thing in Toms River, New Jersey, same thing that's a chemical in the Marine base Camp Lejeune, is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And you start reading all this and you go, maybe Parkinson's is a man-made disease, maybe it's preventable, maybe we can create a world where Parkinson's just doesn't exist or is extraordinarily rare, as it likely was when Dr. Parkinson described the condition in 1817.
How did you end up collaborating with Todd Shear, Dr. Oken, and Dr. Blom?
So Boss and I were, 2017 was the bicentennial of Dr. Parkinson's description of the disease that bears his name. And we gave a talk on maybe a world without Parkinson's, and that went well and was well received. And then we wrote a piece called The Parkinson Pandemic. I don't know if you remember that. That was maybe right before COVID. We actually called it The Parkinson Epidemic. Michael Oken was the editor. Michael changed it to The Parkinson Pandemic. This is pre-COVID. And so that resonated well. And then we reached out to Todd Shear and Michael Oken to see if they wanted to write a book with us. And that's how it came to be.
What were some of the most surprising things you found in writing the book that really you didn't know before, that stood out to you?
I didn't know anything about trichloroethylene. So trichloroethylene, I usually keep my little model with me. It's a simple molecule. People know that water's 3 atoms, H2O. Trichloroethylene is 6 atoms, 2 chlorines, 1 hydrogen, and 2 carbons, 1 hydrogen, and 3 chlorines, hence its name trichloroethylene, or TCE. I think that TCE may be I'll back up. If you look at Parkinson's in the United States, I think most of us know that pesticides are a very likely cause of Parkinson's, and that would account for Parkinson's in rural areas. But in the United States, rates of Parkinson's are higher in urban and suburban areas than they are in rural areas. And so that pesticides wouldn't explain what's going on in suburban and urban areas. And I think trichloroethylene might be the most important cause of Parkinson's in the United States for people living in urban and suburban areas. And I didn't even know that the chemical really existed before starting writing the book and before Dr. Tanner told me a lot about it.
So what are some of the key takeaways or insights that you hope people have when they do read this book?
We can live in a world that's largely free of Parkinson's disease.
That's definitely a goal. I know one of the goals of the book is to advocate policy change, and I know we currently have this National Act to End Parkinson's Disease. In the book, though, it was interesting. I found some history that I didn't know about the March of Dimes, about how that all worked, about polio, and then also the ACT UP group organization that helped spearhead research and development for drugs to deal with AIDS. When will we see a similar thing happen in the Parkinson's community, you think?
About 15 years before we see the incidence in Parkinson's decrease.
Yeah.
Whenever we get our act together as a community, we'll see a fall in the rise of Parkinson's, I think, in 15 years. So the first March of Dimes was in 1938. In 1955, Jonas Salk developed a vaccine to prevent polio. In 1980, a girl got killed in a car accident by a drunk driver who'd been in 4 previous accidents while drunk. Her mother said, "Enough of this," formed MAD. 8 years later, drunk driving was illegal in the United States. Drinking age was raised to 21. Blood alcohol level was dropped to 0.08. 1987, a group of men were getting infected and killed with an unknown uniformly fatal virus. They formed an organization called ACT UP and said that silence equals death. 1996 or 7, protease inhibitors were developed, and today HIV is preventable and associated with a near normal life expectancy. And it may be gone. By the way, HIV may disappear because we're so good at preventing the disease. And so all these 3 great examples all saw tangible results in 15 to 20 years. If we did the same thing as a Parkinson's community, we can create a world where subsequent generations see Parkinson's disease rates falling, not rising, and live in a world that's increasingly free of Parkinson's disease.
Do you think that there are too many voices in the Parkinson community, too many organizations, not one unified voice that speaks for the community?
No, I just don't think they're not loud enough. I mean, this Michael J. Fox can't do it himself. There's this great line. We got motivated to write this book in part because of a book by David France on how to survive a plague. And the plague was HIV. And as you remember, people with HIV were routinely shunned by doctors and hospitals, not to mention political leaders. There was no funding for it. And, you can imagine the diverse voices that were in the HIV community. And Larry Kramer, in a great movie, says, if we don't get our blank acts together, we're all going to die. And silence took us over the room. It just got people really, really focused on what's important. They had a quilt that covered the National Mall. I mean, there's been nothing like that for Parkinson's disease. They did it for long COVID. I mean, for long COVID, they've done this, gone to the National Mall. I've never seen any march on Washington related to Parkinson's disease. I've seen almost no demonstrations saying that paraquat, which the manufacturer knew likely caused Parkinson's disease and covered it up for 50 years. So that means that they knowingly exposed people listening to this conversation right now, likely, according to The Guardian, likely knowingly exposed to people listening to this conversation who now have Parkinson's disease because a chemical company wanted to protect the sales of a $400 million compound. It begs the question, what do people know about trichloroethylene, which has been around since 1920, right? None of us fly in an airplane or drive a car from the 1920s because there are safer alternatives, and engineers have developed it. We have not required that chemists develop safer alternatives to trichloroethylene, and they're still being used in the United States. I just don't think we've been nearly loud enough. We haven't been angry enough. We haven't channeled that anger in a constructive way to drive policy changes. There's 1.2 million Americans, all from vast majority from demographics that overly vote, and no one's made this a political issue.
So what's your hopes for this national plan to end Parkinson's disease?
Well, I hope it gets passed, but I hope we ban paraquat, I hope we ban trichloroethylene, I hope we ban perchloroethylene. These are dry cleaning chemicals. We're using these chemicals so our clothes don't shrink, and we're giving people associated with it 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. I mean, it's madness. This thing causes cancer. This is the same thing that's caused kids to get leukemia in Woburn, Massachusetts, in Toms River, New Jersey. It's caused ALS and cancer at Camp Lejeune. It's associated with a 70% increased risk of Parkinson's among Marines, our best and brightest at Camp Lejeune. We are letting people get off. If we let wrongdoers get off, they are only emboldened, they only do more, and we've done it for way too long. We've been hoodwinked, and it's got to stop.
Well, how do you think that the model in the Netherlands shows that changes can be made that have a positive impact?
Yeah, so this is all tractable. So the only high quality study that I know that's shown that the incidence of Parkinson's, the number of new individuals diagnosed per year, adjusted for age, is decreasing is in the Netherlands, where they showed a 60% decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's from over about 1 to 2 decades, 1990 to 2010. And if you look at air pollution, it was down over 50%. If you look at the pesticides that were in people's fat, which is a good proxy for what's in the brain, perhaps, it was down 75 to 90%. If you look at levels of TCE in the air in 1981, 20 years before the decrease happened, it was among the lowest levels in all of Europe and probably among the lowest levels in the industrialized world. If we get rid of air pollution, if we get rid of certain pesticides, and if we get rid of trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, we will live in a world where Parkinson's likely has a slower rate of progression because people are no longer being exposed to that. We'll likely have a world where future generations aren't affected by these, and we'll have outstanding targets. We'll have outstanding targets for developing new treatments aimed at the underlying root causes of the disease. We're just not getting our act together, and as Boss, Michael, and I said in one paper, we've largely failed the Parkinson's community, and we're trying to rectify that.
Now, as far as treatments go, I mean, most people seem to think that there's not a way of reversing the damage that's done, but more than likely, do you feel that they'll find something that will halt progression?
Listen, we don't cure. Name me a disease that we cure where we don't know medically, where we don't know its cause. If we don't know the cause of your disease, how are we going to cure it?
Good point. Yeah.
And by the way, when we find out the cause, maybe we do get a cure. I'll give you an example in our lifetimes. Remember stomach ulcers? Do you remember what they thought stomach ulcers were due to?
Stress.
They're beautiful. And so people quit their jobs and took, stress-free lives, and what happened? Their ulcers kept bleeding and they died. Do you know what causes ulcers?
I think it's a bacteria, right?
It's a bacteria. Do you know what we do for people with ulcers now?
Give them antibiotics.
Give an antibiotic. Do you know how many people die from ulcers?
Not too many, I would imagine.
Not too many.
That's a good example, really. It's like, for me, I used to be in the medical device industry, and we used to, as part of our being compliant with the FDA, we had to do what they call corrective actions, and you had to define the root cause. Otherwise, without defining root cause, any corrective or preventive action you put into place was just a complete waste of time. So I guess it's the same thing can be said about Parkinson's without definitively saying, this is it. How do you feel like the biomarkers initiative that just got through the gate, so to speak, by Michael J. Fox, how will that help in that quest?
I think it helps identifying people, but wouldn't it be great to know what the root cause is? Because then all of a sudden you could say, we know what the root cause is. Let's see what happens when we give this stuff to laboratory animals, and let's see what we can do to stop the downstream things. For all we know, it could still be, the cascade is likely ongoing, right? Mm-hmm. We could intervene. We could, prevent people from getting worse. Mm-hmm. We could prevent ongoing pesticide exposure. We could prevent people who are living near dry cleaning sites. We could stop their exposure. Mm. We could have people in LA breathing cleaner air, which likely would could slow the rate of their progression of the disease. I mean, there are so many things that we could be doing that we aren't even paying attention to.
Yeah. I remember the saying that correlation does not equal causation.
Yeah. But we know we feed these chemicals to laboratory animals, and they develop the clinical and pathological features of Parkinson's disease. It's really, really hard to get an epidemiological study that shows 150% increased risk of the disease and have that be a false signal. Mm-hmm. And all these things damage the energy-producing parts of cells, the mitochondria, that we know are damaged in Parkinson's disease. The evidence is pretty clear if you pay attention.
Yeah. So the reason why we're not really getting into root cause is really a funding issue, you think?
I think we're misguided. I think we're all trying to chase a cure. Name me a disease we cure medically where we don't know its root cause.
That's true.
I mean, we live in hepatitis C, like, was used to be called non-A, non-B, because they didn't know what was causing it. They found the virus. The previous treatment for hepatitis C was liver transplant. Now we give people a 2-week course, I think, maybe 3-week course of tablets, antiviral agents, and they get cured. We're leaving a lot on the table, but not identifying the root cause of the disease. And we're getting really, really short-sighted by trying to focus on a cure without trying to understand what its cause is.
Yeah. So how will a paradigm shift like that happen?
People got to make their voices heard, and get and demand accountability. Listen, you're paying taxes, and the government's paying $250 million a year on research. Shouldn't you have a voice in how that money is being spent? You're donating money to foundations. Shouldn't you have a voice in how that money is being spent? It's only when you demand accountability. No one's going to drive accountability except for the Parkinson's community. No one ever who's donated to me has ever said, what did you do with my money?
Sure.
And what are the results?
Do you see the PD Avengers as a group that can do that?
I think they're the best group to do so.
Yeah.
Because they're led by and founded by people with the disease. And the March of Dimes was because people got tired of seeing their kids getting paralyzed and stopped being able to swim. MAD got formed because mothers said, I don't want other mothers to experience what I went through. I don't want other mothers to experience what I went through. And HIV was like, if we don't get our act together, if we don't make our voices heard, all of us are going to die. And Parkinson's is the world's fastest growing brain disease. And just because you don't have it now doesn't mean you're not going to get it in the future. Yeah. Just because your spouse has it doesn't mean that you're not going to get it, or your brother, or your sister, or your son, or your daughter, or your friend. 200 people are getting the bad news today that they're being diagnosed with Parkinson's. 100 are dying with it today, just in the U.S.
So you're really a fan of advocacy then?
I'm a fan of change, and if you want to live in a world that's largely free of Parkinson's disease, if you want to live in a world where better treatments are available for Parkinson's disease, and if you want to live in a world where your disease course is slowed, you better make your voices heard.
Yeah. You think a lot of the tenets in the book, like the path that's outlined there, is helpful for guiding that kind of a change?
Yeah, we hope so. That was our prescription for action, and I think my colleagues may have thought I was a little pushing the envelope there. I don't think we pushed the envelope enough. The study came out 2 weeks ago that the Marines at Camp Lejeune, which is the Marine base in North Carolina, was contaminated with these dry cleaning chemicals, trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, at levels up to 3,000 times that are safe. They looked at Marines who served at Camp Lejeune. They looked at compared to Marines who served at another camp on the West Coast called Camp Pendleton that was also contaminated. But they found the Marines at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. 70%. The Marines, A, by definition, are healthy, right? This is healthy. 2, they're young. So they're 20 years old when they're at Camp Lejeune. 3, they're there for a short period of time, 2 years. And 4, they only followed them into their 50s in general. So in a short period of time, healthy, these are largely men in their 20s who are getting exposed for a short period of time have a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's. There are tens of thousands of contaminated sites throughout the United States alone that are contaminated with this dry cleaning chemical, including over a dozen dry cleaning chemicals in the Monroe County where I live, in Rochester, New York. People need to wake up and pay attention, because I think this is likely the most important cause of Parkinson's disease in suburban and urban areas in the United States. And oh, by the way, as bad as it is for Parkinson's, it's way worse for causing cancer. It's known to cause cancer. The World Health Organization says it causes cancer. The EPA says it causes cancer. And it causes leukemia in kids, likely prostate cancer, multiple myeloma, likely breast cancer, likely brain cancer, liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The list is long.
So like you said, without a possible or definitive root cause, some of the treatments that are being proposed, do you see any benefits in any of those things?
Well, some are being targeted at genetic causes. There's about 15% of people have an identifiable genetic risk factor for the disease. And so there are some drugs called LRRK2 inhibitors, for example, that are trying to prevent the overexpression of a protein from that mutation. It turns out trichloroethylene also causes overexpression of that protein. So these genetic causes and these environmental causes, not only may they have synergistic interactions, but they may have similar mechanisms of action. And so these drugs could be helpful in that. I think there is some challenge into treating the disease after a large portion of the nerve cells have died off, but I prefer not to prejudge and say, I'd love if we knew the cause, we could get rid of it and be doing a ton of research aimed at addressing the underlying root causes, just like we're doing a ton of research aimed at underlying genetic causes. But 85% of people don't have a family history of Parkinson's disease. 85% of people don't have one of these identifiable genetic risk factors. We're addressing the tail, we're addressing the icing, not the cake.
So there's still a lot to be learned. Like one of my group asked the question about, is there any correlation to the amount and duration of exposure to trichloroethylene? Because he used to use it as brake cleaner for years, but only every few weeks or a month.
Yeah, we don't know. There are less than 30 papers published on trichloroethylene and Parkinson's disease, according to the Library of Medicine. Less than 30. Like, no one is doing it. No one's investing money in it. No one, we wrote a grant and we were just ridiculed for our thoughts that this is a principal cause of Parkinson's disease. The reviewers just couldn't get their arms around it. I can't even answer that question. I suggested a dose-response relationship. I've had a patient, who worked as a bus driver in a depot where they were likely using degreasing agents, and she developed Parkinson's disease. The Camp Lejeune was 2 years of exposure, likely at very high levels and likely in the drinking water, not occupational. We wrote a paper with Boss Bloom on TC as an invisible cause of Parkinson's disease. I don't think for TCE, I think there's a dose-response relationship, and that longer periods are associated with greater risk, I would think. But we don't have good answers to these important questions.
So there's been absolutely no animal studies whatsoever on...
No, there have been animal studies. There have been 30 total studies, and we summarized them in a paper. I'll put it in the chat. Multiple investigators have fed it to laboratory mice and laboratory rats, and they developed the clinical and pathological features of Parkinson's disease. It's there. It's all there. We just need to get reframed. Just as you said, we need a paradigm shift. We've been trying to identify the genetic causes of Parkinson's disease, and that's fine, and that's been beneficial. But the vast majority of people with Parkinson's disease don't have genetic causes.
Yeah. Well,
85% do not have genetic causes. And we're underinvesting. If you look at all the funding that NIH is going, if we wrote a paper, it's 5 times more papers on the genetics of Parkinson's disease than on the environmental causes of it. There are 30 papers. Boss Bloom himself, by himself, I think has published nearly 1,000 papers. Just give you a flavor. 30 papers total in the world's literature and this chemical has been around since 1920. The first paper linking it to Parkinson's disease is from 1969. There are a grand total of less than 30 papers.
So why are people so stuck in the genetic paradigm?
I think we don't like to confront uncomfortable truths. I think we'd like to think that these things are either consequences of aging or consequences of genetics. The human genome, sequencing the human genome, a great accomplishment, and that's been fantastic. And for rare diseases, listen, I spent 10 years working on Huntington's disease. I never said the word, it's a genetic disease. It's monogenetic due to one gene. I don't think I said the word environment once. But these common diseases, congestive heart failure, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, they have small genetic components in general, but the vast majority of it's environmental. It would have been screened out in the history of humans before present time to have these things. And it's just the way, and people can't switch. The people who are in it for the genetics, it's really, really hard for people to switch paradigms. You have to look for new voices and new ways, and the Parkinson's community must make their voices heard. If they do not make their voices heard, we're going to have another 2 decades with no major therapeutic breakthroughs in Parkinson's disease. We've been at this for 20 years, no major therapeutic breakthroughs in the last 2 decades. We've been sold people have been saying cures around the corner, cures around the corner. I mean, how long has that been going on? And people, if you don't demand accountability, you won't get results.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know in the book you mentioned the comparison between the funding for Parkinson's versus AIDS and versus Alzheimer's is drastic differences in funding.
Yeah. So I told you, the NIH spends $250 million on research aimed at Parkinson's. Medicare spends $25 billion, 100 times more on caring for people with Parkinson's disease each year. So we can either spend $100 caring for people with Parkinson's disease and $1 trying to get better treatments, and how about better for finding out the root causes of it, or we could flip that. Or we could just 100-fold increase in it. HIV gets from NIH 10 times more funding for HIV research a year, and HIV affects the same number of people as Parkinson's disease. And look at what HIV is. Rates are going down. That is unfathomable, right? I'm not that old. And 1990s, the idea that HIV would be going down in 2020, I mean, people were worried about millions and millions of people. And because of the research, because of the activism, how many of us don't have HIV? How many of our kids don't have HIV? How many of our kids practice safe sex because of them? These guys are heroes. And they're never called out.
Yeah.
Like, no one knows who Larry Kramer is. David France, I mean, these Peter Staley, I mean, these guys are just giants who changed the course of human health and human history for the better.
Good point.
And we're not doing it. We have not answered the bell. Very few of us. Michael J. Fox needs some help. Brian Grant needs some help. David Spinney needs some help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So, if the paradigm shift were to occur and research in earnest was developed or put towards root cause, looking into things like trichloroethylene and paraquat, how long do you think that would take to develop that as, the clinical studies to prove that, and then to move that into the field of trying to find a way to prevent it?
15 years, we'll see a decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. If we got our acts together, if we ban paraquat, if we ban TCE, we ban PCE, and we clean up contaminated sites, 15 years later, we're going to see a decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. And why do I say 15 years? Because that's what it took for a March of Dimes. That's what it took for HIV. That's what it took for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Drinking and driving is socially unacceptable. I mean, any people who have kids and grandkids, you only have to tell your kids about that. Like, my son's planning his prom and he doesn't drink. I mean, good for him. They're already figuring out who the designated safe drivers are. I mean, that didn't happen a generation ago. And that happened because a mother lost her daughter. She suffered unspeakable pain. And she said, hey, we don't need better trauma centers. We don't need better ambulances. We don't need better spinal cord rehab. All that could be true, by the way. She said we need to address the root cause of the disease. Root cause of this disease is drinking and driving. She didn't even say drinking. She didn't even say driving. She said drinking and driving. We get our acts together, we'll change the course of Parkinson's disease. But we need to get our acts together.
That's a powerful message, and I think something that all of our members can appreciate for sure. I did get a question from one of our members asking about methylene chloride as a solvent. Is there any connection with methylene chloride?
I don't know. So the two solvents that have the best relationship are trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, which has additional chlorine atoms. Sam Goldman and Carly Tanner, I'll put the paper in there, have looked at others. I just don't know. I mean, because there have been not enough studies done on it. But I'll put the twin study that they did, and I think it might even have methylene chloride in there.
Okay.
It's hard to do these studies because we don't randomize people to get exposed to pesticides and not to get exposed to pesticides, right? And then the exposure could have happened years ago. It could have happened when you were a kid. I'm sure there are people who have Parkinson's, who were exposed to pesticides as kids, and then figuring it out 50 years later is really difficult. But just because something's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Probably means we should be spending a little extra effort trying to do it.
Speaking of research, is the Project Brain Health still taking place in University of Rochester, the leopard PD's trial?
Yeah, so we're trying, we want to get new treatments too. And so we think we need to prevent the disease and get new treatments. And I think the way to get new treatments is by figuring out what the proximal cause is of the disease. And we're coming up with new measures of the disease, including a qualitative research, a rating scale that patients would say how the disease is affecting them, like a health index related specifically for Parkinson's that was developed based on what people with Parkinson's said was most burdensome to them and most disabling to them. And this is a new scale that my colleague, Dr. Chad Heatwall, has developed. If people want to participate in our research studies, they can join our registry at Project Brain Health.
Okay,
or they can also email me, and I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay, that'd be great, because that definitely sounds like a nice opportunity for us to share our experiences with you for more information. Just a curiosity question: when you wrote the book, was there any personal experiences or stories that came out of that book that you could share with the group that really struck you?
Yeah. How about if I do a little reading?
You've got an earmarked copy like mine with all kinds of bookmarks.
So you mentioned the individual. This is chapter 5. This is from retired Master Sergeant Jerry Insminger, who's the reason the Camp Lejeune is Camp Lejeune, that we all know about it, is because this man lost his daughter from leukemia at age 9. And so he served in the Marines for 24 years. After he finished serving, he found out that he heard a newscast that cancer-causing chemicals were found at the Marine base. He dropped his plate of spaghetti. He realized why his beloved 9-year-old daughter had died from leukemia, did die in the likely cause. And then he realized it wasn't just his daughter. It was all the Marines, he was a drill instructor, all the Marines he had trained, all their spouses, all their dependents, and the civilians. And so he says the benefit of the doubt should go to the people, not the chemical. In 1988, Danny Fromm was a typical Southern California teenager who enjoyed working on cars, especially his red 1972 Chevy Nova with a black top. He paid $1,300 for it, money he had saved from working as a gas station attendant at the local Unocal 76. Fromm and his buddies replaced the car's engine, which made it really awesome and really fast, he recalled. The car gave the 17-year-old the freedom that he craved, freedom to do what he wanted when he wanted, freedom that he no longer has. Straight out of high school, Fromm began working in the aerospace industry, cleaning circuit boards with the solvent trichloroethylene, TCE. Never warned of any risk or provided with protective gear, he inhaled the sweet-smelling chemical and exposed his skin to it for 8 hours a day over the course of a decade. When Fromm was 35, he noticed that his right pinky kept twitching. Stress, his first doctor said, and recommended a little wine. His doctor gave him a much different diagnosis, Parkinson's disease.
That's a powerful story, for sure. What's the best advice you could give our group for Parkinson's, short of the advocacy? What other advice would you give our group?
Well, I think there's lots of practical things you can do. So given that these are the causes, one, we should be minimizing our exposure to these things. So if you have a well, you should have your well tested for pesticides and these specific chemicals. Many times, wells are infrequently tested, not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. And when they're tested, they're usually just tested for bacteria and not often pesticides and these chemicals. So if you're like up to 40 million Americans get their water from a well, I would do that. Even if you don't have a well, I put a carbon filter like Pure or Brita on our faucet at home because I want to decrease my exposure to chemicals. Levels that people have said have been safe in the past, we can find are no longer considered to be safe in the present. Second, I would avoid pesticides like the plague. Not all pesticides are linked to Parkinson's disease, but the list is long. And as far as I can tell, really, really hard to differentiate and determine which pesticides are being sprayed. Someone, I think, saw something about getting sprayed on their lawns. My lawn has lots of dandelions. If I had Parkinson's, I would have nothing to do with pesticides. And that means not only my lawns, I'd consider what's going on in the golf courses. We've discussed people who live downwind of the golf course might be getting exposed to it. I buy organic. I wash all my fruits and vegetables with water and a vegetable wash, which is basically like soap for vegetables, because many of the pesticides are fat soluble, especially the ones that go to the brain, and so you want to get those off. I wear a helmet when I bike. I bike to work, and I do vigorous exercise. So you should be doing vigorous exercise to decrease your risk of developing Parkinson's. And I think your group knows well all the benefits of vigorous exercise, and they're only increasing. The evidence for the benefits of exercise are all increasing. I think air pollution is a big issue, but depending on where you live. So if you live in Southern California, my kids got their grandparents who live in Southern California air filters for their home. So you can just get like a little air filter near your bed in your bedroom or your kitchen or both. If you drive through polluted traffic, I would make sure my windows are rolled up, that I have air conditioning on, and I recirculate the air so I decrease my exposure to air pollutions. Air pollution has been associated with the increased risk of hospitalization among people with Parkinson's disease. So I think there's tons and tons and tons of things that we can be doing to perhaps either slow the rate of progression of the disease or stop ongoing exposure. The analogy I like to do is like, if you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor tells you to do?
Stop smoking.
Stop smoking. But are we doing that with Parkinson's disease? Is anyone saying stop your exposure to pesticides? Is anyone saying stop your exposure to these chemicals?
That's true.
I think we're missing a ton of things that are low-hanging fruit right there for us to have, and for us to live longer and healthier lives, even if we do have Parkinson's.
One of the folks in my group asked, is it possible that the higher rate of occurrence is due to increased awareness and testing, or are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg, only detecting a small fraction of the actual number of cases?
Yeah, I think we're only detecting a small fraction. We know we're only detecting a small fraction of cases. In the United States, they went door to door and identified people in Mississippi, in a county in Mississippi, half white, half black. And of the people that they identified in the 1970s, 40% of them had never been diagnosed with Parkinson's. 40% of Americans in Mississippi, a biracial county, were identified to have Parkinson's in the 1970s, had never been diagnosed with the disease.
Wow.
The least thing is in the Netherlands, where 12% of people, that was the lowest rate, where 12% had not been diagnosed. In rural parts of Bolivia, it's 100% of individuals were never diagnosed with disease. There are tons of people suffering in silence today with Parkinson's, even though they have a fundamentally treatable disease. They have a treatable disease, and people aren't being diagnosed and aren't being treated with the disease, and that needs to end.
Because I think I mentioned in the book there's some stigma associated with different cultures.
Yeah, there is. Listen, Michael J. Fox's most enduring contribution may be reducing the stigma of Parkinson's disease. That's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, you guys know this better than I do. It's not easy to have Parkinson's disease, and it's not easy to have Parkinson's disease or any disease and be the representative for that. And he's been doing that for over 20 years. He needs some help. He needs some Avengers. He needs some people to join the fight. I mean, he says he probably got it from some exposure to some kind of chemical. Well, if Michael J. Fox is getting it from some kind of chemical, why aren't other people getting it from some kind of chemical? And I'm giving you the names of some of these kinds of chemicals that might be doing it. We just need to get on it.
Well, we can only hope that the advocacy leads to that happening. Let me just ask one more question. Other Parkinsonian-like ailments like TSA with toxic-like origins, do you think there's a connection with that as well?
Yeah, so I really spent the last 5 or 6 years focusing on Parkinson's disease. I think these other toxicants, they all damage the energy-producing parts of cells. Many of them are nerve toxins. So I don't think Parkinson's is the only disease. So I would think diffuse Lewy body disease would likely be implicated. I would think multiple systems atrophy, but those studies have been less well. I think PSP would be. These are chemicals also are linked. I think pesticides and ALS is a huge thing. Air pollution and Alzheimer's disease is an enormous risk factor. If you want to think clearly for a long period of time, you want to avoid air pollution. The nose might be the front door of our brain, and all these chemicals are inhaled. When we inhale things, they bypass our liver, which detoxifies chemicals, and it bypasses our blood-brain barrier, which is kind of like a fortress that prevents bad things from getting in. And the nose might be a weak front door by which these things are entering our brain and causing lots of wreaking havoc.
Yeah, I know for me, when I was working in the plating department, working with trichloroethylene, I smelled it, got it on my hands all day long. So I think that's the connection for me personally.
I mean, look, I don't know how many of you saw Dr. Tim Greenemeyer, who the most cited research paper this century is by Dr. Tim Greenemeyer, Todd Scher, and one of their colleagues, in linking a pesticide called rotenone to Parkinson's disease. And he was exposed when he was doing the research. He said he was probably not as careful as he should have been, and he got Parkinson's disease, and he thinks he got it from rotenone. And when we're doing the human experiments on ourselves, I don't know what more evidence people need to rally around. And by the way, this is not a partisan issue. I mean, Parkinson's disease affects Republicans, it affects Democrats, it affects capitalists, it affects communists, it affects singers and songwriters. We should, get really clear about our role as individuals in creating a world where future generations don't have to put up with the disease that we are putting up with.
Are you hopeful, like I said, that the PD Avengers will lead the charge on that?
Yes, but we got to stop looking for other people. Everyone here needs to join the PD Avengers. So if you haven't joined the PD Avengers, pdavengers.com. It's free to do so. Larry, Sonia, and Tim are very nice people.
They are very nice.
And join it. We need to change the course of this. We can't what's it going to look like 50 years from now, 20 years from now? Other people are getting the disease and they're going to say, but you knew. You knew that drinking and driving was unsafe, and you continue to allow that to do that. I mean, we see that in other parts of society. I mean, it's crazy. We need to wake up. Life expectancy today in the United States is less than it was when I was in medical school.
Yeah.
That's unfathomable. The greatest accomplishment, perhaps in human history, was a near doubling of life expectancy between 1900 and 2000. A near doubling of human life expectancy. Humans have been around for 200,000 years, Homo sapiens. And we had a doubling of life expectancy in 100 years of that 200,000 year history. And we're giving it back.
Yeah.
We're giving it back.
Like you said, we're spending only $250 million for research, but $25 billion to care for people that have Parkinson's. It doesn't make sense.
And that's just what Medicare is paying. Forget the suffering, forget the caregivers, assuming that's nothing.
What final message would you like to give to our group before we let you go? I know you're a busy guy.
Well, one, I'm apologize for being late again.
No.
Two, we can change the disease. We can change the course of the disease. If we follow the examples of polio, if we follow the examples of drinking and driving, if we follow the examples of HIV, we can create a world where Parkinson's disease is increasingly rare, not increasingly common. I can't think of a better contribution that a physician, a neurologist, a Parkinson's disease specialist can do. And I can't think of a greater gift that the Parkinson's community can bestow on future generations than to have one where they do not have to suffer the disabling consequences of a terrible disease.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dorsey. And if you don't have it already, folks, make sure you get this book and read it through. It's an excellent read, and it really helps us to appreciate where we can go if we only have the will to do it. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, Ray.
Thank you, Roger.
See you another time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.